Good evening, everyone. I'm Ellen Futter, President of the American Museum of Natural History, and it is my very great pleasure to welcome you to tonight's program on conservation, wilderness, and the American dream. The program is presented in the spirit of Theodore Roosevelt, a great New Yorker and a great president, indeed our conservation president. In fact, tonight's program is part of our celebration of the unveiling of just this past fall of the completely restored and refreshed Theodore Roosevelt Memorial at the museum, which I hope many of you have seen. As some of you may know, Theodore Roosevelt had deep ties to this museum. TR's father, Theodore Roosevelt Sr., was one of a group of public-minded civic leaders who came together to found this museum for the benefit of our city and our nation in 1869. In fact, the museum's charter was signed in the Roosevelt family home on the 20th Street. As a boy, young Teddy loved this museum, even contributing his own personal collection of such items as a bat, 12 mice, a turtle, the skull of a red squirrel, and 4 bird eggs, all to the museum's then fledgling collections. Throughout his public life, TR's love of nature served as a guiding beacon, and he maintained ongoing relationships with curators from this museum, including the great ornithologist Frank Chapman, with whom he had a 20-year colloquy around issues of nature and conservation. All of this informed TR's presidency in profound and lasting ways and contributed to his great conservation legacy. He placed some 230 acres under federal protection, including national parks and forests, and the first federal bird and game preserves, and set aside 18 spectacular natural wonders, such as Grand Canyon and Devil's Tower. There is a TR quotation on the wall of the great rotunda upstairs that reads, "The nation behaves well if it treats the natural resources as assets, which it must turn over to the next generation increased and not impaired in value." He understood the importance to our national identity, of preserving our country's natural habitats and resources, and he saw conservation as one of our duties as a society and also, importantly, as an essential element of democracy. Aldo Leopold, the great naturalist and environmental ethicist, once wrote that wilderness is the very stuff that America is made of. The encounter with wilderness is what shaped us as a nation, reinforcing those pioneer qualities that we think of as fundamentally American: self-reliance, fortitude, hard work, fierce independence, and innate love of the land. Of course, living in the city, one could lose sight of those things, but our link with nature as individuals, as Americans, runs deep and is an important part of everyone's identity, not only part of our shared past, but part of our shared present and future. In fact, in an era of escalating climate change, volatile weather events, population growth, and attendant resource scarcity, one might argue that the importance of wilderness and of reinforcing our connections to it is more urgent than ever. So we are especially pleased to have this distinguished panel here tonight to explore these issues. So let's get right to it. I am pleased now to introduce our moderator for this evening, though in truth, he needs no introduction. You all know Tom Brokaw from his illustrious broadcast career, which brought him into our living rooms every night as anchor and managing editor of NBC Nightly News. He is one of our most trusted broadcast journalists, and he has received pretty much every award in the field, some of them multiple times. He serves now as a special correspondent to NBC News, covering key and complex stories in political, social issues, economics, and culture. He is a best-selling author, most notably of The Greatest Generation, with which he not only coined a phrase, but sparked a new way of thinking about what each generation can contribute to the larger good. He is also, I must add, a valued and involved trustee of this museum, lending his expertise and his wisdom to so many of our initiatives. But fundamentally, Tom is a child of the American West. He was born in South Dakota, and though New York City is lucky to claim him much of the time, he might be happiest on his ranch in Montana, in close touch with our American wilderness. So we are in very good and able hands tonight, those of a great American of our generation, Tom Brokaw.
I'm not quite as short as Ellen, so I'm going to remove this, if I may, for just a moment. That was a far too generous introduction. That's in part how she keeps me on the Board of Trustees, in fact. Flattery will get her everywhere. Just one reminder, if we can, please remember to turn off your cell phones as we begin this evening. And another occasion like this, I gave that reminder. It was 2 summers ago at the height of the scandal in London. And I suggested to the audience, and he actually was a member of the audience, I said, turn off your cell phones or give them to Rupert Murdoch for safekeeping. And it got a fair amount of attention, but some of his defenders thought I was unfair, but Rupert, being Rupert, came up to me afterwards and said, that was great. We are here today to talk about what is, inarguably, our most dramatic landscape in America, the American West. Now, I know that most of you come from the urban areas of the Eastern Seaboard, but my guess is, and my hope is as well, that as Americans who see from sea to shining sea this country and have a curiosity about it, you have been in the West. Nonetheless, as someone who spends a great deal of my time in the West and grew up on the edge of it in the Great Plains, I'm still quite startled when we have friends come to visit us in Montana and say, oh my God, I had no idea until I got here. Yellowstone National Park, Glacier, Moab, Utah, the Grand Canyon, all the wild rivers, the big game. It is the home of the American savanna. We have more big game in all parts of the American West than we do anywhere else in this country. In our valley alone, in Montana, we have bear, elk, deer. Last year, our ranch antelope herd quadrupled from 25 to about 100 head. And in the last 6 years or so, we've had the exciting presence and the controversial presence of American wolves that have been released out of Yellowstone as well. So it is a dynamic environment, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, that pays no attention to the artificial political boundaries that we have established in this country, because it's a vast ecosystem. And in that ecosystem are the highest mountains, the deepest canyons, the driest deserts, the most crowded resorts for skiing now, wide open spaces at the same time, the largest forest, the wildest rivers, the greatest concentration of our indigenous people, our largest and most ancient fossils. And all of that is represented in the American West, not just there in the place that begins really as you cross the American prairie and then begin to enter the American West, but it's represented as well in its own way within the walls of this museum, because that's in large part what Teddy Roosevelt had in mind when he helped found the museum, and as someone who became a son of the West himself and saw the glories and the splendor of it and was determined to preserve it as much as possible, and not just preserve it, but study it as well. So that's going to be a big part of our evening here tonight, and to do just that, we have a remarkable collection of people who are deeply involved in the issues that we're about to talk about. I'd like them to come on stage now, and as they do, I'll be talking about them. Douglas Brinkley is one of America's preeminent historians. He is the man who has written about Teddy Roosevelt and, of course, his commitment to the wilderness. Following him is Mike Novacek. He's the senior vice president of the American Museum and the provost of this school. He is our uber brain. He is Mr. Science himself. Mike is the kind of guy that when you were in school, you want to sit next to him during testing time. Lisa Graumlich, same thing. She comes to us from what they call in that part of the world, UW, University of Washington, where she is the Dean of the College of Environmental Studies. Rick Ridgeway, my longtime dear friend, one of America's preeminent mountaineers, the first American to summit K2, an adventurer of the highest order, an author, and now the Vice President of Environmental Initiatives for our other very dear and close friend, Yvonne Chenard at Patagonia. And Paul Vahldiek, who's a lawyer, an entrepreneur, a man that I met in the Bahamas a few years ago at his place called Deepwater Key. He's a committed environmentalist. He has a ranch called High Lonesome in west central Colorado, and to give you some idea of the scale, the ranch encompasses 325 square miles. And he is deeply involved in the issues that gather us all here tonight. So we're going to have a conversation, and then we're going to ask you for questions that you may have at the conclusion of just a few remarks from our distinguished panelists. Douglas, I'm going to begin with you as I take my chair, and that is, what would Teddy Roosevelt think about the American West today? There are still vast spaces, obviously, but there's new energy development going on, there's new settlements going on, and as I fly over that part of the world, I see more and more communities rising up in larger senses and the smaller towns disappearing. Well, what do you think about what's going on there today?
Well, Theodore Roosevelt, as most of you know, was born here in New York City, but he had a mother that was from the South, from Georgia, and she was for Robert E. Lee and the Confederates. His father was a committed Yankee Knickerbocker who loved Abraham Lincoln and Grant, and he was born in 1858 here in New York, so T.R. grew up in New York City with the Civil War going on, and they were hellacious family fights, and T.R. found redemption in the West. He didn't have to pick South or East, and his whole life became Western focused, largely because photographs were coming in boys' magazines of Yellowstone and the canyonlands of Utah, on. And he, of course, went to North Dakota to find solace after his wife and mother died in a tragic way, and he wrote books about North Dakota and said if he wasn't for the time in the Badlands, he never would have been president. What he meant by that is he loved everything about the West. And what he learned about it, and I think he would bring to it today, was this notion of wilderness, that we needed to have urbanization because he was asthmatic. He did not like urban sprawl. He was always worried about public health, and that he thought you needed vast wilderness areas as buffers to the cities. And he famously, as president, he was president in 1901 and 1909, he took a great loop tour of the West. He went to Yellowstone, and it was big news because he was not allowed to bring a gun in. And TR always carried a gun, but it was a national park. Ironically, today guns are allowed in national parks. And he killed a shrew when he was in there, which was illegal. But he killed it and shipped the skin back because he noticed it was a rare shrew that our Smithsonian didn't have. That's how committed he was to naturalism. And then he was there with John Burroughs. From Yellowstone, he went to the Grand Canyon, and TR stood on the rim of the canyon. Rough Riders from the Spanish-American War around him and said, "Do not touch it. God has made it. You will only mar it. Leave this great canyon alone." And from the Grand Canyon, he went to L.A., and he talked extensively, and 50,000 people would come to his rallies. And he said, "You're going to ruin California by overpopulation. You can't build this big of metropolises in a desert zone." He went up to the Redwood Country, Santa Cruz, Big Basin State Park, and told people to take the signs off of the redwood trees. They were naming them Lonesome Pete and things like this because they were desecrating these great trees and that we must save them. And he went up camping with famously John Muir. And after that camping trip and time in the snow together, Muir, founder of the Sierra Club, he went and saved Mount Shasta and extended the boundaries of the West. The bottom line, Tom, is that he was a believer that wilderness is what made America and our public lands what made us different than Europe. He had climbed the Matterhorn and saw no game and no wildlife, and he wanted to make sure that we kept our wilderness in America, whether it was the Appalachians or Rockies or the Sierras, very much alive. He would be pushing for public lands that belong to all of us.
And Michael, he did have the great clarity of his vision about the West, but there are those profound changes that are going on out there now. both man-made and natural. We're losing water resources, for example. Global climate change is concentrated in the American West. There's a big dispute about the impact of energy extraction from the West now. As you look at the West as a scientist and as someone who is the keeper of the flame here at the American Museum, what concerns you most of all about the changes that are going on and how you as a scientist and your team adapt to that?
Tom, I'll answer what you've asked me, but first what I'd like to do is put that in context about what the American West means to the museum and means to me, because somehow I feel a little strange being up here. I have to confess, for those of you who don't know me, besides being a provost or whatever and managing scientists here or leading the charge on scientific enterprise, I'm a bone digger. I dig holes in the ground. And the American West, I think, has a special place in this museum as well as in people's mind and passion generally for what it once was as well as what it is now. And one of the important aspects of the American West, it is the best place in the world that records the so-called dinosaur extinction event. And that is the last time the Earth experienced a mass extinction event, one that many scientists claim, and I agree, we are experiencing this century. If there's a lesson from the past, it's preserved in the West. So what's happening in the West right now that causes some alarm? Obviously, climate change, we can see the effect of climate change in terms of the changes in range in animals. Like many other places in the world, many of these animals are moving upslope toward the peaks of these mountains to a point where they no longer have any habitat at all. Habitat fragmentation is probably the biggest sort of scientific concern. And I should say in this part, we're not just simply observing this from afar, because we do have the Southwest Research Station, which is one of the most important Western U.S. research stations. It's in southern Arizona for recording a lot of these changes that we have available. So I think the whole idea of land fragmentation, and what does that mean in terms of biological species? Not only that we're endangering diversity, but we're reducing the chances for gene flow between populations in these fragmented areas. And so the idea of building some kind of strategy, and I'm sure we'll talk about it here, that provides a continuity between fragmented special natural places to allow these plants and animals and many other organisms to exchange their genes and sustain themselves is a primary concern of many of the scientists here who are devoted to these questions.
And Dean Lisa, in your work at the University of Washington in environmental studies, for a lot of people in this country that I talk to, they say, I don't see climate change. It doesn't seem warmer to me, or I don't see the changes that they're talking about in cataclysmic terms. When you get to the West, is it a more graphic change?
Tom, it's absolutely more graphic. And as a paleoclimatologist, I study long-term patterns of climate change and develop the kind of data where we can say with great confidence that the world has warmed 2 degrees Fahrenheit over the last 100 years, and people kind of glaze over. And then you say, well, and the West has warmed 4 degrees Fahrenheit over the last 100 years, and people kind of twiddle their thumbs. And that doesn't mean anything when it's just a number degrees Fahrenheit. So I want to tell you a little bit about what that means to the physical and biological systems. Let's take Glacier National Park in your favorite state, where we know that when we first explored Glacier National Park, there were about 150 glaciers. When the park was established in 1910, there were 150 glaciers. Today, there are 25. We've lost 125 glaciers from Glacier National Park. And my science colleague, Dan Faegre at the park, who tracks all of this and is looking closely at it, previously was predicting that all of the glaciers would be gone by 2030, although there's ways that these processes accelerate, there's a lot of positive feedbacks, and he believes we might actually lose them before then. Now, it's not just snow and glaciers that we're losing. We're actually losing the snowpack, the year-to-year snowpack extent, depth, throughout the West. So right around the end of World War II, we started to actually measure snowpack seriously, in part because of its implications for water resources. We've got great data, thousands and thousands of observations. And we know that in a typical year now, we have 30% less snow than we did over the 20th century. Last couple of decades, we've seen that. Snow moves off the landscape 2 to 4 weeks before it used to. And it turns out the research that I do with my students has also shown that in the past, these droughts would kind of move from the northern Rockies to the southern Rockies and then back again. But since 1980, we have seen this pattern from the Canadian border to the Mexican border. The snowpack has all disappeared. So when you lose snow 2 to 4 weeks early and you have less snow, it's not just bad skiing. Everything biologically speeds up. Spruce budworm, any of the number of insect pests to western forests start to reproduce more quickly. And so those of you that have driven through the West see there's vast areas where trees are dying. This is what scientists, how they talk. Leaf litter, the pine needles that sort of exist between pine trees, dry out faster. So once you get an ignition, the fires go. We know that 2 degrees Fahrenheit increase in temperatures will increase forest fire area burned by a factor of 4, and we're seeing it. U.S. Forest Service currently spends half of its budget fighting fire. Now, what that means is if we think about the challenge to Roosevelt's generation, it was identifying land for parks, Yellowstone National Park, bringing in the Army to protect it, and leaving it alone. We can't do that today. Parks are now embedded in a much larger landscape that will forever be fundamentally changed, and it creates a new way in which we need to think about stewardship of parks, wilderness, wildlands in a much more connected way than we ever did in Roosevelt's time.
And the man to your left, Rick Ridgeway, and I have both appeared before political groups in the West talking about an initiative that he's deeply involved in called Freedom to Roam. Rick, describe for this audience what freedom to roam means.
Well, Tom, as many of you in the audience probably know, at our company, Patagonia, we're really committed to environmentalism and conservation, especially of wildlands and wildlife. And we also, as some of you may know, every year have what we call internally a campaign, where we select a topic of emerging importance in the environmental conversation, and we use all of our communication channels to go deep on a single topic for 1 or 2 years. Beginning in the early 90s, about 90 or 91, we selected the topic of wildlife corridors, and we went deep for a while. And the reason we did it was what Michael said about the fragmentation of habitats. And human development had so isolated habitats for some species that the populations in those isolated habitats were at threat of extinction. And conservation biologists had developed an idea that if these isolated habitats were connected, if the cores were connected by corridors, then effectively you increase the size of that habitat and can perhaps forestall extinction. But this whole topic of what's now called landscape connectivity was just coming on the radar. So we spent a year in all of our stores, in our website, and all the catalogs that you've seen, telling our customers about this. And then about 6 or 7 years later, we were again trying to figure out a topic to align around our campaign. And we realized that in those just half a dozen years, a whole additional threat had come on the screen. Now, in addition to habitat isolation caused by human development, that these fragments were additionally starting to shift right from under the feet of species. And it was now a double-edged sword. So we decided we would go again into the topic of wildlife corridors as a solution to this issue. And we as a company, being pretty good at branding and marketing, decided what was really needed was a brand for this idea of landscape connectivity. And that's where the idea for Freedom to Roam comes from. Freedom to roam for animals to not just survive but thrive through this century and into the next. To give wildlife the freedom to roam as TR envisioned it at the turn of the previous century. So we decided we would go on a big marketing campaign, and the first thing we did was get ourselves inserted into an annual meeting of the Western Governors Association in 2008, and I asked Tom to give the keynote address and introduce my presentation, which he was kind enough to do. And it was a home run success. We really got this idea onto the radars of 14 of the governors of the Western states, 4 premiers from Canada's border provinces. And we did it by telling good animal stories, stories that the governors would remember. In particular, we told them about a wolverine in Montana that had been collared by wildlife biologists. And we introduced this guy by telling the governors that, when you weigh 25 or 35 pounds and you can fight a grizzly off of its kill, there's only one word for you as an animal, and that's badass. So the governors kind of liked that. And then we tracked the movements of one single male wolverine as he wandered through Glacier National Park into Waterton National Park, moving over into British Columbia, circling back through Idaho. And this wolverine's terrain was hundreds and hundreds of square miles. But then the most astonishing thing about this wolverine was that once they collared him in the middle of the Montana winter, the wildlife biologists were following him on their radar screen when they saw him enter the basin on the south side of Mount Cleveland, the highest mountain in Glacier National Park, in the middle of the winter. And then he starts right up the mountain, up the south face, which no climbers had ever been able to ascend before. And to their astonishment, this wolverine climbed the entire 5,000 vertical foot south face in 90 minutes, got on to the summit, and hung out for 2 hours. And we told the governors why? Well, because it was there. But then what we really told them is that the wolverine and all the other animals in that system are at threat because of fragmentation, because of climate change, because wolverines depend on snowpack for their reproduction cycle, which is now disappearing. And we told them the solution to this is this idea of large landscape connectivity. And in addition to building awareness through events like that, we've now succeeded in a partnership with the World Wildlife Fund to actually bring the idea into on-the-ground conservation. And in our area in the West, and again, perhaps to continue to use Montana as the example this evening, the World Wildlife Fund has a project going in the Great Grasslands, going from the Dakotas through Montana all the way up into southern Canada to protect the cores, but now to connect those cores with corridors. And it's going to work if we can do it. It's being proved by the animals themselves. They're tracking collaring grizzlies in Glacier that are on their own, moving east across the plains, out towards the Charlie Russell Grasslands Reserve. And they're repopulating the plains. And if we protect those corridors and pathways for them on their own to follow, then we will come close to regaining the grassland that Lewis and Clark saw and that TR fought for. That's where we're at now. We also have a philosophy of a big tent. That means that efforts like this have to be multi-constituent. In that project I just described to you, you can't do it without private landowners, without ranchers, without engaging them and bringing them in, without the support of hunters and fishermen, as well as all the other recreationists. We're doing that. That's our philosophy, and we're making progress.
Paul Vahldiek, you represent a new generation of big landowners in the American West, and there are a number of them, more of them all the time. And you bring to your ownership an ethos of conservation and environmental sensitivity. At the High Lonesome Ranch, you've been actively involved in trying to get, in effect, a kind of master plan for the West among big landowners so that you preserve the values that brought you there in the first place. As you do that, what's the biggest obstacle that you bump up against?
Well, Tom, I would tell you, as a Texan that kind of migrated like the Wolverine, I went north, though, to Colorado. You run into your neighbors, the federal government. And, you know, back home in Texas, there's very little, because of the way it was settled and came into the nation as an independent nation, there's very little federal land. And I was always used to, if we had a problem, picking up the phone and calling your neighbor. Well, now your neighbor is either the Secretary of Department of Agriculture or Department of Interior, and how do you work effectively and fluidly to accomplish goals in a very large bureaucracy? And, you know, I think one of the challenges as a private landowner is how do you work effectively, and I think it's crucial in the West to learn to work in public and private, because I think what TR started with the public lands and what Rick just said, we've got to tie in not just the public lands, but the private lands to have that connectivity between these core wild areas that are public lands. And so at the ranch, we've started, along with some other ranchers, many of you would know names, and a lot of them, like me, you wouldn't know their name, the Western Landowners Association. We've just announced it. We have 10 million acres that want to band together to care about connectivity, trophic cascades, biodiversity, healthy landscapes. And I hope that helps address and empowers us to work even closer with the great federal agencies that we have and to be more effective. But the other challenge, I think, in answer to the question, is what's happening with mineral development in the West, and how can we have working landscapes, minerals, and conservation at the same time? That's a big challenge.
And talk about the scarcity of water and the use of water in mineral extraction in the West, and how that's a critical component in going forward, Paul.
Well, it is. I happen to believe that I worked as a lawyer for many years, and I happen to believe that my landscape that I've been lucky enough to inquire and that I'm a steward of, or I have a fiduciary duty for, is how do I hold it together? I'm not worried about 5 or 10 years. I'm worried about 50 and 100 years. So how do we make a national park-sized property conserved into the future? And I would argue that it's not through wilderness or preservation, it's through adaptive mixed uses of that, with conservation flag at the forefront. And what I hope we're doing at the ranch is figuring out how we balance human recreation, ranching, whether it's cattle or bison, and mineral development, but always putting conservation first and making those decisions. We've got an 18-mile stream restoration project at the ranch. We're trying to restore a valley, not a fishery, but a valley in the water table, and bring it back to what it was before settlers came into those valleys and destroyed the dams and the other structures and grasslands in there, to return the water table to where it was. Because I think, as many of the panelists have said, you keep hearing the same terms, connectivity, water, and those challenges we face. And I hope with the institute we're building at the ranch, We can do applied science work that helps give me answers, because I'm totally unqualified to manage a landscape like this. And that we find answers, we can share that with other landowners in the West.
Mike, in your bone digger capacity, when you go to the American West, Paul raised the role of the federal government, and it's not just one entity you're dealing with there. It's the National Forest Service versus the BLM and all the shared permits and so on. When you find a site, or when there's an area that you're interested in doing more scientific exploration in, are there barriers or obstacles that you have to work your way through in terms of state government and agencies that control those areas, to say nothing of private landowners?
Well, Tom, in truth, I think it varies from place to place, from state to state, sometimes from county to county, from bureaucracy to bureaucracy. Some areas, and I can cast that in terms of a larger issue here too. But first, some of the land managers, the BLM people, a lot of paleontology is done on BLM land, where there's more flexibility in terms of digging. We're like mini miners, we're not making giant holes in the earth, but we do alter the land to find those bones. And so many of the BLM managers are people who were trained as paleontologists or geologists, and they have a sense of that. Those are usually the best partnerships, where you have Western Wyoming, for instance. I worked for years out in Western Wyoming, in the Wind River basins and some of those areas, and the local land manager was really great because she went to my alma mater. She went to Berkeley in the paleo program around the same time I did. So, she was a partner in that work. Other places are harder. But what's really interesting about this, and in terms of even the national park system, over the last 2 years, I was a member of a committee headed by Rita Caldwell, the former head of National Science Foundation. And it was a committee for science, of scientists, to advise the national park system on science, on what kind of science. It's sort of related to some of the points that are raised here. And there were two really major points that came out of our report, which is now published and accessible to all of you. It's on the Department of Interior website. One was there has to be a better sense of partnership with scientists working in public lands, because we need this. As Lisa said, we can't just simply think of a park as an archive or a monument or as a memorial. It's something that we have to worry about in terms of management. Yeah. And the second is there has to be more of an inculcation of science within the park system, and more, I think, more uniformity in the way various parks deal with scientific issues. There's a lot of variation from one area to another on what the priority is in terms of the questions that we're raising here, frankly, in terms of climate change or habitat fragmentation or water or invasive species. It's another huge issue with parks and public lands.
Douglas, before I get to some other specific issues, try to project Teddy Roosevelt to today. Would he be for the American West what Mike Bloomberg is with guns? Would he be out there banging the drum and say, "This shall not stand"?
He'd be for the federal government. He was a huge believer in the federal government. If Lincoln could emancipate the slaves, he could use the full power, executive power on behalf of wildlife and land. If you go to the exhibit here, you'll see in 1903, famously, Frank Chapman, the ornithologist here, warned from the museum here, warned President Roosevelt they were slaughtering all the birds in Florida. Floridians didn't care. It does no good to have Massachusetts have great land custodians and ornithologists and Audubon societies when those birds hit Florida and they're getting slaughtered. Every woman here 100 years ago would have come tonight wearing a bonnet with an ornamental feather. It was the fashion. We were slaughtering these species. TR said about an island in Florida, Pelican Island by the Indian River, "I so declare it a federal reserve," and he created 51 of the federal reserves. And today, U.S. Fish and Wildlife, some of the bravest and smartest people I know, that we have, our country has over 500 national wildlife refuges. but they're being starved. They're being starved by much of the conservative movement today. There's an attempt to keep slashing the budgets. During the George W. Bush years, they were getting rid of wildlife biologists from Fish and Wildlife. And this is where Rachel Carson came from, U.S. Fish and Wildlife. This is where the modern environmental movement's born in many ways. So I think there's beating up on the feds all the time. I think that we've got a remarkable system of parks, monuments, and forests. I think the big challenge is climate. And how are we going to deal with this? And I'm writing about FDR now, and he created the CCC, Civilian Conservation Corps. He put unemployed people to work, 18 to 22 years old, and they saved all these parks. Can we do a CCC for climate? Can we get young people involved in a tangible way instead of just all of us giving our Cassandra stories, about how bad the situation is?
But wouldn't TR, given his unconventional ways of looking at things, be responsive to what Paul is talking
Absolutely.
about? Because the climate has changed, and not just climate change, but the kinds of landowners that are out there now and got big things and say, hey, look, Mr. President, we'd like to be able to do some things on our own here. Would he be after the bureaucracy the same way he was after the people who, in terms of preserving the chance to preserve the bird life in Florida?
He said if you lose any species, it's like slashing all the Rembrandts. So if you take the black-footed ferret up in the Dakotas, TR is part of the endangered saving that would be for the Endangered Species Act. Ranchers in the West don't like the Endangered Species Act. So TR, oddly, the cowboy president, would be more on the environmental left today than he would be with today's conservative movement.
Dean, when you go into Montana and look at Glacier National Park and spend time in Washington and in Idaho and deal with climate change, how does the business community respond to that? And I want to get to Rick on that next, because part of the Patagonia Environmental Initiative has a lot to do with getting small businesses involved. Do you just get blank stares?
That's going to be one of those nuanced questions, because it would depend on which part of the sector you're talking about. I think the biggest challenge to the business community is actually understanding what we're going to do about managing carbon and having those decisions made so there's a business climate where people can plan going forward. So it's really thinking through to what do the solution paths look like and which of those paths we're going to take, as opposed to the kind of gridlock that we're really seeing right now.
Rick, pick up on that and talk about 1% for the planet.
Yeah, well, we at Patagonia have tried to influence other businesses to follow our lead with conservation and habitat protection. As a company, early on, we decided we would take 1% of our sales right off the top, not profits, but sales, and tithe that back to the environmental community, focused in particularly on habitat conservation and wildlife protection. Currently, that is a $6 or $7 million annual fund, and currently it goes to a little over 750 environmental organizations. That's how many grants we give away each year. So we've also created another organization called 1% for the Planet to encourage other businesses to follow this model. And we have nearly 2,000 other businesses who have joined us. Most of them are small, but to date that group has given back to the environmental movement north of $100 million. And mostly to small NGOs working to save their backyard rivers and wildlands and beaches and forests. So that actually it's enough to move the needle. We're also involved in other efforts at our company which are a little more indirect, perhaps a little more difficult to appreciate, but in our view have perhaps an even greater potential on the efforts that we all need to make to conserve these wild lands. We have organized a little over 100 other companies in apparel and footwear, our two sectors, to join forces in a coalition to develop uniform and standardized ways to measure the environmental impacts of our businesses and to use that tool to manage those impacts, and most importantly, at the very upstream of our businesses and our operations to manage our impacts on ecosystems and habitats. And through that management, perhaps bring greater visibility to all of you, to civil society, but especially to governments, about the impacts that businesses are having. That's sort of the effort. And I must say, we have surprised ourselves to how successful we've been. North of 100 companies we have on board right now collectively represent 40% of the entire market share for apparel and footwear on planet Earth. And we've got them all committed towards a common goal that at its headwaters has conservation and habitat protection. So let us hope that efforts like this save the day, or at least they'll be a part of it. I can assure you that.
Paul, when you deal with your neighbors in Colorado with your very ambitious plans for changing the way they think about conservation, how much pushback do you get now? And since you have been there, has there been a greater appreciation of climate change, especially given the drought of the last couple of years in your region alone, to say nothing of south of you? Are they beginning to say there may be something to this? Are they still stuck in where they were before? Are they willing to become more proactive about doing something?
If you're talking about ranchers, I would probably be the odd man out there. We are a member of 1% for the planet. I do believe in the Endangered Species Act, and in fact, it's a great tool for us to deal with the other problem that I mentioned earlier in the ever-expanding mineral development in the West. And so for mule deer and sage grouse and those things, it's a very effective tool to try to slow down mineral development and have a landscape-wide plan instead of one well at a time. But I think with climate change, we've certainly seen it, Tom. In the dry years we faced, we had no snowfall winter before last. And that affects agriculture, your human recreation, our grazing recreation, and what we can put back for 1%, which we're members of. And so Yvonne's a friend of mine too, and I'd get whipped if we weren't. But we certainly have been paying a lot of attention to and hope that the precipitation levels could increase. I have to root against us on this, but I know it's a factor that we're facing, and it impacts everything we do on the ranch and the wildlife, which is why we're trying to restore the water tables to bring them back up in those eroded landscapes.
One of the fixed parts of the American West is that if you've been in a state and a part of it for 2 generations, then you're considered a native. But you get Coloradoans saying to you, hey, you're from Texas, don't come up here and try to tell us what to do. Because there is that very provincial pride that goes on and a resistance to the change of way things have been done over a long period of time. Well,
and I think you're right, and it's hard for me to hide. So we haven't been trying to tell anybody what to do, and in fact, we've been trying to learn ourselves, and there's no clear path. But we really hope that mixed uses on our landscape will allow us to keep the landscape together, and we hope others might see what we're doing and can share some wisdom, hopefully with the universities doing all the science on our landscape, that science can help us all make decisions out west. And I think that's one of the great things about this museum and all the scientists involved is if we have a stewardship duty to these landscapes, then we better listen to folks that understand those processes to help us make those decisions. So I really applaud all the scientists that have been fortunate enough. Michael Soleil, the father of conservation biology, and really started a lot of this landscape scale thinking. He's been to the ranch many times, and I've, for once in my life, a trial lawyer is being very quiet, and I listen more than I talk, and so I appreciate the learning for that landscape.
I think we have somebody here in the audience as well, Amy, down in the front, who tell us about your interest and your connection to business groups who are interested in these issues as well.
Hello, this has been really interesting, and I want to go to Mr. Brinkley. You were talking about Teddy Roosevelt and declaring this is what has to be done. China last week stated that its environmental degradation costs it 3.5% of its GDP. If that's what they say it costs, that's what it really costs. KPMG estimated that the 3,000 largest corporations cost $3 trillion of environmental damage a year. If we are going to make the changes so that it's not that climate change has happened, climate change is happening. We are just now beginning to feel the carbon from 25 years ago. And my experience with the business world as an environmental activist who has worked on several transformative initiatives, businesses get it because they are losing tons of money. They cannot predict the P&L. They're in trouble. And so I wanted to ask all of you, when and how can we have the federal government and the American zeitgeist agree that we are going to have to spend a ton of money to transform the economy from petroleum-based and fossil fuel-based to renewable energy and sustainable sourcing technology, et cetera. It's going to be a ton of money, 3.5% of GDP or more. So that's what I wanted to ask all of you.
I agree with everything you said. Incidentally, as a sidebar, when Gifford Pinchot, the great forester of the first one that TR picked, when FDR was young here in New York up in Albany, Pinchot came and showed FDR in the 1920s a picture of China in a painting of forest in China, and then showed him a picture of the deforestation that went on there, and it had a powerful impact on FDR. And the federal government is the savior of the West. The West was being raped by everybody, by extraction industries, big timber, stockyard people. So there's a war between the federal government and the West in many ways. I'll tell you one right now, Big Bend National Park in Texas. Ken Salazar, our last Interior Secretary, is trying to continue what FDR wanted, one big park along the Rio Grande between Texas and Mexico, because the species don't know the border, and it is a wildlife corridor like we're talking about. Holy hell broke loose with the ranchers of Texas because they don't want Mexicans, and they're afraid that that'll be a way to get Mexicans coming in through the park by creating a new designation. And I think we have to realize there's a really anti-federal government movement going on here right now. And it's not helpful when, in my mind, I don't see the oil companies, because Shell buys ads in magazines and things. I think we're being manipulated by a lot. We need a president that declares a war on climate, and that we've got to really act like a Roosevelt on this climate issue. And it's Herculean task we have ahead of us. And the business community is going to be part of that fight. Everybody's got to be. But we got to start with young people, and we got to start getting people ready for the fight.
Lisa, what do you see in terms of encouragement that there's going to be a movement that is going to be more profound?
Well, I think some of it has come from the scientists themselves, and I sort of poke fun at my own community and saying we tell you really uncompelling things about something that's going to happen to your children's children and try to get you to invest money right now to address it. And I think two things have changed. First of all, the scientific community has understood that that isn't very effective, and that we really have to start focusing on what are the impacts right now that affect business, that affect health, that affect things that are far more tangible to people than some of the kinds of impacts that we have focused on in the past. So we're starting to see the scientists step up at a time where we're also starting to see extreme events and drought in particular starting to really change some of the ways we're seeking to do business. I am an optimist and believe that that is going to start changing the perceptions, which in turn train the behavior and the commitment that we're going to need to actually take this on.
Paul, you live in Houston. My guess is that from time to time you have lunch at the Petroleum Club. Has there been any change in attitude about climate change?
Well, I believe it depends on probably whether you're talking about a major or independent, and I think there's even diversity among the majors. But one of the things we're trying to do at the ranch, and I do believe in mixed-use development, as I said earlier, because that'll be something that can help keep my landscape together and to pay for it. Otherwise, it's got the expense of trying to maintain a national park. And I believe in bringing corporate America, whether it's Patagonia or Chevron, to the table and figure out what solutions we can find to how to address those matters as best we can, as long as we are still using energy. And I hope it could be natural gas instead of, as we look toward other wind and solar and other alternatives. But for now, we're still saddled with a tremendous energy use, and I hope energy allows us the ability to keep landscapes together and to bring great corporate partners together that have different ideas. And I think I've had extensive conversations with those in Chevron and Shell, and I hope we can help turn the tide and meet somewhere in the middle.
Mike?
Tom, could I comment on this from a different perspective? The question is when? When will this convergence occur? And I think a really important part of this equation is education, enlightenment. There's a sense very often that environmental problems are happening elsewhere. We're talking about the West, and they're very educated people, or people who aren't so educated may think of those problems as sort of parochial, as part of the Western problem, not how it affects them, not how it affects us globally. I think our President Ellen Futter talked about the important mission of this institution in science education. For many people, the West will not be their experience firsthand. For many of our visitors, especially from our urban areas, their only experience with nature in any given year, or less frequently, is the Bernard Hall of North American mammals, where they see those wonderful environments. So the connection, the knowledge, the importance of these places and how vividly they are connected with the human mind and passion, and as I've said before, getting people to fall in love with nature is really part of this, because you have to have some desire to save it. And it takes a strong public statement to motivate leaders to do that as well. Leaders like Teddy Roosevelt had great insight, and that is essential. But improving our sense of what's going on, what scientists can tell us, and how their lives are interconnected with all these problems is a huge, huge challenge, especially in a country where, frankly, there's a huge deficit in areas of science and science education.
We're going to take questions from the audience. Oh, I'm sorry. Chris, just introduce yourself.
Yeah, hi, my name is Chris Velarde. I work here at the museum, and just a quick comment and question for the panel to follow on what Mike just said. I'm a child of this museum. I grew up in these halls, and my professional career as a scientist was inspired by the dioramas here, the scientists here. But my life as a citizen was inspired by encountering the word wilderness in the front entry of this museum when I was really just starting to read that big, beautiful word, wilderness. And I didn't really know what it was. And it was going out west. I had the privilege to go out west when I was young. And that's what inspired my life as a citizen. It was intimacy with this legacy that was left by Teddy Roosevelt and others. And what I want to ask you all, and this follows on really what Mike said, is what role does that poetry of understanding the power of place and play in our society, and how can we bring that to more people? Is it growing our wild places? What do you do for kids in New York City who don't get the lucky break that I got? who never get to actualize that word wilderness in that hall, and essentially have that drive their membership of our society and their civic duty.
There's a great book by Roderick Frederick Nash called Wilderness in the American Mind, and he raises the point, what is a wilderness? You live in New York City, wilderness might be the Adirondacks. Well, if you live in Alaska, wilderness might be the Arctic. I mean, it's a term that's hard to know what it is, but it speaks to us about having wild places in some ways. I think it's a magical word, wilderness, and it's one of my favorite words. And we've got Thoreau's birthday coming up in 2017, and wildness is the preservation of the world, Thoreau said. And it's more profound than it sounds when you talk about it. We've got to trust that the corporate entities to be the great custodians of American landscapes has not been proven in history. Whether it's slaughtering of birds, slaughtering of buffalo, whether it's despoiling places, chopping down forests, it's been activist groups. And I think we've got to now, on the climate issue, get to the young people, like the museum's doing, like you're doing at school. We've got to get a new generation ready to fight, because it's not going away soon, the climate problem.
Lisa.
You know, I'd like to comment on that and urge a little bit of caution here. I think sometimes when wilderness is the best and highest nature for urban kids that can't access it, it means the nature that's in the abandoned lot or the little flower coming out of a sidewalk crack is second-class nature. And my thinking here really evolved in conversation with Molly Steinwald at the Phipps Conservatory in Pittsburgh that has really talked about how there's a stepping stone there in terms of, particularly for urban kids, to be able to understand how it is that the nature that erupts in that neighborhood, even if it's not particularly being stewarded as a natural area, and connect that gradually to the more wild areas. In the Seattle area, we do that. We get kids out of less wealthy neighborhoods doing restoration projects in the stream down the block, and all of a sudden the notion of then going to Mount Rainier to do a conservation project is not the huge leap it would have been otherwise. So nature's good. You know, we can't dismiss that stuff grown out of the sidewalk.
Courier today has a huge movement, urban wilderness. It's been Salazar's main thing. That is the big focus. And how do you get inner city kids involved with conservation and caring about the natural world? And your museum here does a great job of that.
We have some questions from the audience. What role can cities play in conserving wilderness? Well, the easy answer to that is mobilize politically and be conscious of what is going on. But there is also a political reality that everyone has to understand, that these are two separate and unequal cultures in terms of the populations and what they think about where they live and how they can be great stewards of it. So if you go to the American West, you have to be aware of that as well. Let me just tell you a small story about somebody who is very familiar to you. Senator Schumer came to Montana. I didn't know him very well. He was still in Congress at that point. And he came to the ranch, and he'd grown a beard, and he was wearing a sweatshirt because he was terrified somebody out there would recognize him. And what he was afraid of is that they would be all over him about his attitudes about 55-mile-an-hour speed limits and conservation of fuel and so on. And he had a memorable experience at our ranch and met a lot of our neighbors, none of whom knew who he was, by the way. And then he came back and he said to me, I get it. You can't get anywhere going 55 miles an hour. I was trying to go from Yellowstone to your place. It would have taken 3 days. Other friends of ours, and I'll even mention who it was, Ben Bradley, the editor of the Washington Post, came, and it was striking to me. Here was a man who was the managing editor of the paper at the time when we had the great fires in Yellowstone National Park. Ben had never really been west before. And he came to our ranch wide-eyed, and he said, "My God, when did that happen?" I said, "Ben, it was all over the news a couple of years ago." He said, "It's just terrible." The fact is, it was a good thing, because fires replenish life in the West, and they're critical to the cycles of life out there. So one of the things, I'm speaking for the panel here, that cities can do is people who live in urban areas go visit the West and don't just put your nose up against the glass, but become students of the West and find out how the cycles of life work.
Well, and that's what I was going to say, Tom, and I think some answer to one of the last questions. We're not a designated wilderness at our ranch as public lands, but we're open to the public. And so whether it's our ranch or other lands that you can visit, I think it's incumbent upon us, as other panelists have said, is to get kids into the outdoors so they can see it. I mean, we host youth groups, whether it's Trout Unlimited or many other organizations, Women in the Outdoors, and I can't tell you how many people that we see on the ranch that have never seen the stars because of light pollution. So if you let a kid learn to dream and see the stars, and I have special expertise because I was pretty young and I looked up and it was my next door neighbor, Neil Armstrong, that was standing on the moon. And somebody asked me in an interview once, "Where'd you learn to dream?" And I said, "I think it was next door." But so, you know, I too would encourage you to go to public lands and see the great parks, but to also go to private lands. We're semi of a national park size. We just have a different gate entrance fee, or other lands.
Lisa? And then Rick?
I think there's an incredible role of dense urbanism in this question. What we're seeing in the West is migration. People want to move west for the great recreational opportunities, the beauty of the landscape, and naively might think the best solution is to have everybody have a 5 to 10 acre parcel of that dream for themselves. And that will take your neighbors, the working ranches, the farmers, out of business immediately. And it's those buffer lands that are the matrix that Rick's talking about that's going to allow the connectivity for us to adapt to climate change. So oddly enough, us in Seattle look at Manhattan as our future. We're at about 6,000 people per square mile. You guys are at 26,000 people per square mile. We need to look a lot more like you in terms of dense, vibrant urbanism if we're going to keep our working landscapes intact in the West. And it needs to be the models of how you take the High Line project or all the incredible things that New York City people know how to do and bring that know-how to the West.
And I was actually going to comment on what Lisa just said, that cities are a model for how we can concentrate our human footprint, right, and also relieve that footprint from the rural and wild landscapes that we'll need to conserve if our brethren wildlife are going to make it through this century and into the next. At its very highest level, our Freedom to Roam initiative is meant to inspire people to align around the vision of a planet where we all agree that we, the human beings, need to go out about our business on this part of the planet, and here, through science, identifying the parts of the planet that we have to leave alone for wildlife to go about their business so that they have the freedom to roam. And using science, we need to align around what Paul just said, that there are other areas on the planet where you can have mixed use, and you can do it in ways that are compatible with the long-term needs of wildlife. And if we don't do that, then we're facing just what Michael mentioned at the beginning, which was the extinction of the dinosaurs. And you all know that. You've heard about the looming 6th grade extinction, and it's real. If we don't align around these visions, then we will be responsible for the elimination of at least half the species on this planet. And that's no world any of us want to leave to our kids and their kids.
Well, and I think some of you might be offended that I have ownership or private deeded lands of that magnitude, but I would point out and wish to point out that even sometimes folks in Denver that far west don't get what we're doing in the mountains or the western slope. The best thing I can do as a steward of that landscape is to own it and invite folks into and share it and learn from it and to do science, because so much of our science has been done on public lands and very little on private working lands to help us make good decisions. And the thing that we need to do, the worst thing I could do would be to sell 10-acre plots of my land. There goes the wildlife, there goes the water, there goes water to the cities of Denver and the use of it. And so I hope if we're good stewards, and I think that's a real question I can understand, who will be a good steward and how long can you do that? If we don't keep these landscapes intact, they won't be there for our kids, your kids, and future generations. And so I want a wolverine to be able to find its way down across Vail Pass. And I hope that our stewardship, even as private folks, allows for that kind of connectivity and that interface between public and private lands. Because I think in today's world, I think folks thought 100 years ago the public spaces were enough, but I think most scientists will tell us that Yellowstone's not a big enough ecosystem to be healthy and biodiverse on its own. So we've got to tie in public and private landscapes to have a healthy West.
You know, Paul, there was another wolverine that was tagged just after M3, and all of a sudden he got some hair and started heading south. And he left Glacier and went through Yellowstone, and then went through the Tetons, and then he crossed over to the Wind Rivers, and he walked the entire length of the Wind River mountain range, crossed those flatlands there, got into the Rocky Mountains, started heading south, and they lost contact with him just out of Denver as he was heading towards the High Lonesome. So maybe you've got a wolverine out there yet, but...
We do have wolves. The wolves, as they mature, have gone on their walkabouts, and we've had wolves they've tracked into the Meeker and Ranch area. They've dispersed, is I think the more scientific name, all the way from Yellowstone, which that's a whole issue, and I won't even bring up carnivores anymore.
Yeah, but urban audiences have to understand as well that this stuff is not cut and dried. It's very complex in so many ways. And people live there, and they've lived there for generations. They're trying to make livings. For example, it's very easy when I'm in New York to get people very romantic about the reintroduction of the wolves. And we're big supporters of that. We have been from the very beginning. Meredith, I've been in Yellowstone Park. We've gone in the wintertime to see them and to see them at work. They're in our valley. And then they killed 3 of my neighbor's dogs. And we have friends who are big supporters as well. They have a big sheep ranch. And they really cut through that sheep population 2 years ago. So those are tough issues that have to be dealt with, and they're not just black and white and cut and dried. I'm going to conflate 2 final questions if I can, because I think it addresses really the kind of, if you will, city-rural issues that we have to deal with. One of the questions is, if we had to create another wilderness area, where would you do it? And then a question that goes with that is, what about the impact of industrialized farming? Is that going to lead to another Great Depression and another Dust Bowl? I'll just begin with that. On the other wilderness area, having grown up in the Great Plains as I did, as I say, when you cross the Missouri River in South Dakota, then you're in the American West. In the eastern part of the state, it's still small farms. But you'll remember a couple of years ago, there were professors at Rutgers who wanted to create the Buffalo Commons in South Dakota, which seemed like a good notion at the time. Let it return to the grasslands, let the bison come back, the small towns were drying up. And then something happened. Agricultural practices got to be a lot better and a lot more efficient in every conceivable way. So you go to the Great Plains now, and the farms are much larger, much more efficient, and much more efficient in every conceivable way in terms of the the fertilizer they use and the rotation of the crops. So I would like to have seen more of a grasslands national park to have the restoration of the American savanna. But it butted right up against the desperate need for food around the world and the efficiency of these new, young, more scientific farmers that exist. Just one quick story about it. I have a friend who farms 40,000 acres in central South Dakota, grew up very poor, wanted to become a more efficient farmer, and he's done that. He grows not just corn and wheat, but he grows soybeans a lot because that's a very popular product now. And it has great nutritional possibilities. He has on one entire edge of his farm a windmill farm. He has wind power all along one ridge, and he stores it for companies in his farmyard as well. Last year, he took me out to a very remote corner of his farm with two other very enterprising young farmers who were big in hog production. And they'd made a deal. We have to put hog-producing sheds in very remote areas for all the obvious reasons. And my friend Todd had given them that space, and then they, in turn, would convert on their property that they were using the effluent into the best kind of organic fertilizer in the world. So that was a perfect combination of a kind of coming together of modern science, but at the same time, it meant that we weren't going to get the grasslands. So Mike Novacek is a bone digger. If you could create another wilderness area, where would it be?
You know, it's really interesting. I first of all, from a scientific perspective, I think there are some very important areas that really need attention. And at the beginning of this, I talked about how ranges were being narrowed and constrained by climate change. So saving some of these high, quote unquote, alpine areas, not just in Colorado or Montana or Wyoming and many of the mountains I've loved and roamed around in, but also in New Mexico, Arizona, Nevada, a series of magnificent mountain ranges with very important endemic fauna and flora. Endemic meaning they're not found elsewhere. And I'm talking about bugs too. I'm not just talking about, wolves and bears and everything else, which are great, but they're very important. You might want to save a stonefly, as oddly as it sounds, because those are important habitats. The other one relates to my childhood. I grew up in Los Angeles, of all places, but as many of my colleagues and my former training ground, UC Berkeley, will say, there's some extremely important habitats in the Santa Monica Mountains, in Ventura, in a lot of the lands. Maybe if they're not total wilderness, they've got some amazing things like salamanders and frogs and other kinds of organisms that are really worth managing, protecting, and building viable environments. And that environment, I think, even going back there most recently, the fact that that environment's around a city like that has a huge impact on both an aesthetic and an environmental experience. So,
Rick Ridgeway, you've been all over the American West.
I have, Tom, and as a mountaineer, you might expect me to name some yet unprotected mountain area, but actually, when asked the question, where would be your favorite national park, it has to, of course, align with your own personal interests. And curiously enough, you might be surprised to know that I would love to see an extension to the Charlie Russell Wildlife Refuge so that it could move both north and south and extend from its current million-acre footprint to a 3 million-acre footprint that could recover out on that tall grass prairie, the vision of Lewis and Clark, that we could recover all the ecosystem that they saw in 1803 and 04. We're working, as I mentioned earlier, in the World Wildlife Fund to try and realize that vision right now. And I think there's a potential to do a big part of it in partnership with ranchers out there who would have to ranch in ways that are wildlife friendly. And that, of course, is going to require adaptation. And in all fairness, the adaptation, that there has to be funding mechanisms to subsidize them through those changes. That has to be on the table and part of the solution. At the end of the day, As Tom's friend Brian Schweitzer, the governor of Montana, says, at the end of the day, it's about grass. Do the buffalo get the grass or do the cows get the grass? And there's not enough grass for everybody, but yet you can have wise, I think, mixed-use solutions. They're out there, but my own favored vote would be for a great grasslands national park that had the big grizzlies back out on the plains, where because the living is so easy, they exceed 1,000 pounds, where there's still prairie dog colonies that have black-footed ferret everywhere, and where the swift fox roams again, where perhaps even the condor comes back. The entire assemblage of megafaunal species that Lewis and Clark found, that would be a legacy I'm confident TR would get behind.
Well,
I'd like to raise a question and not necessarily a specific place and answer. And I think with what Rick just said, we've had a model of what TR did and many others after it in setting wildlife refuges aside in public lands and national parks. Maybe the answer for the next 100 years is some combination, as we've talked about today, of public lands. I would say around our own lands, there's oil company surface-owned lands, there are private lands, there's BLM lands, and I think and wonder if the dialogue really shouldn't be how you bring different entities together in a common managed plan, and then and that's 3 million acres, by the way, which approaches Yellowstone. If the dialogue really shouldn't be how we manage these cooperative areas, because can the federal government really afford to buy them, fund them, bring them together? And through the mixed use of these cooperatively owned or managed public and private lands, do we maybe have a new model for a national park size conserved area?
some in the audience may be aware of something that's going on in central Montana. A lot of people from New York are involved in it, as well as in the West, and that is the funding and the creation of what is called the Prairie Preserve. And they've put in a genetically pure bison herd, for example, taken down all the fences. They've put together great parcels of land, and you can now go visit it and see what the prairie looked like in north central Montana 120, 140 years ago. And they are going to have some accommodations. They're going to get Mongolian yurts so that they can put some people overnight, but they've hired, at some expense, great biologists to work at it. So there's that kind of thing going on as well. In our corner of Montana, there's a very active environmental group that is called the Montana Land Reliance. And they come to ranches and get them to put their property into easements so there can't be development. And they did a very clever thing dealing with the Montana political culture. Their motto is cows, not condos, so that people understand that the land is going to be left open and there won't be the development that, frankly, has, not where Paul lives in Colorado, but in other parts of Colorado, is kind of run over the state, honestly. So there are these efforts that are going on that are unconventional, and I'm going to wrap up the session by asking each of our panelists to tell this audience, if they want to go to the American West, where should they go, and what should they look for specifically? Douglas?
Well, I'm going to say, since we're here for the spirit of Theodore Roosevelt National Park up in North Dakota Badlands, where TR found himself. I mentioned before his asthma. He got a lot of relief there from the clean air that came down. And if you bring your family to Theodore Roosevelt National Park, you can see bison, you could see antelope, you can see prairie dog. And they built the town of Medora, unlike a lot of over-commercialized gateway communities. They've kept it in a mom and pop sort of fashion. A lot of people go to Tom's great state of South Dakota to see Mount Rushmore and go to that Badlands National Park, but I'm quite fond of the one up in North Dakota.
Michael?
Yeah, well, again, I'm a bone digger, paleontologist. Notwithstanding all the wonderful forests out west and all the forests back east, paleontologists hate trees, they block the view. They block the view of the rocks and the bones in those rocks. And I have to say, probably my favorite place, the place I really recommend for an experience of awe, is the Escalante Wilderness, Water Pocket Fold, the Henry Mountains, because although this is government land, national park, there's a national monument, it's the stretch of that rock, that beautiful red rock, that white rock, that pink rock seems limitless. You feel that you're standing on the edge of infinity when you're on the rim of some of those canyons. It's just amazing. I haven't been there in 10 years, and I'm desperate to get back there. So you should go.
Lisa?
Oh, this is fun. I think I would choose Yellowstone National Park. First, for the obvious reasons. It's beautiful, it's fascinating, it's powerful, it's big, and it's got all the legacies associated with Roosevelt. But second, as a citizen, it so inspires me because it was the political will and the science that brought the bison back from their genetic stock at the Bronx Zoo earlier in the 20th century, and then more recently, we had the political will to bring the wolf back to Yellowstone. We can solve these big problems, and Yellowstone is a testament to that.
And the reason the wolf is important to bring back is it was the head of the food chain. What a lot of people don't realize, it wasn't just a random decision, because the wolf was at the top of the food chain. The grizzly is actually below the wolf. And what you see in Yellowstone Park, if you're lucky enough to see a wolf, they'll kill a 12-year-old female elk, for example, and they'll have their feet on it, and then the grizzly will move in on it next. And then what they didn't anticipate is that the ravens are all over all of those kills. So you have all of this stuff going on in Yellowstone. And when you get there, if you've never been there before, you'll say, thank God they made this a national park. It is one of the most astonishing places anywhere in the world. It is a true laboratory. Rick?
Well, despite my support of a New Grasslands National Park, I am a native Californian, and I still live there. And I think I would stand in the shadow of John Muir and repeat his invitation to TR to come to Yosemite. And no doubt many of you have been there. But all of our great country's great natural wonders, it is our natural cathedral. And if you haven't been there, I guarantee that you will be just as inspired as TR was. And it would very likely have the same influence on you that it did on him to really help galvanize his commitment to wilderness and wildland preservation in our country.
Oh.
I thought I was in great shape going last, but you just stole mine. But I would just say, if you haven't been to our national parks, go. And I had a similar experience when I was 12 years old with a redwood tree up in, I think, in Muir Woods, north of San Francisco. And if you haven't seen a live redwood and they're towering, go see one. With all deference to not liking trees. And then I would invite you to go look at some private landscapes too and see what people are doing and what we're talking about and how the influences of both can interact and hopefully help heal all.
I'm just going to leave you with one story about the West. Every year that and I've been going there all my life, I always learn something from wildlife. I learn from the natural surroundings. Every year there's a lesson for me. But my favorite lesson came about 5 years ago, and this is the kind of experience that you can have in the American West, that you can't have anywhere else in America. You need to get off the beaten path and not just go to the routine stops that you would expect. You should go to the national parks, but then find the blue highways and even the gravel roads. It was in June, and we had very high water in the river, as we do every year, and I'd gone up to a bluff overlooking the river on our ranch. And out of a grove of conifer trees came about a dozen female elk and their new calves. They had just dropped them in the last 2 weeks or so. calves were kind of unsteady. And they walked right up to this raging river. The mother cows did with her calves at their side, and they waded in. And the river was very swift and very wide at that point. And the far bank was covered with heavy hawthorn bushes. And so it was a real struggle to get up on the bank. But everybody did except one calf. And it couldn't make it, and it got swept downstream. Now, the herd had looked at me and decided I was from a safe enough distance they weren't going to be concerned. But I'm caught with a dilemma. What do I do about this calf? Because it is sweeping downstream, I don't want to see it drown. But just then it kind of finds an eddy and gets back up on the sandbar, goes back up to the original crossing place, tries again, fails again. Tries a third time, and failed a third time. Meantime, I'm watching all the cow elk on the far bank. And they're all standing there very patiently, keeping their eye on this calf. And the calf, after the third failed attempt, goes and stands on the sandbar. It's obviously shaking. As God is my witness, one of the cow elk separated herself from the herd, walked down to the bank, looked across at what was obviously her calf, nodded her majestic head, waded across the river, nuzzled the calf, and then leaned over, nuzzled it again, and then led it upstream to a much safer place. They crossed the stream together. They were reunited with the herd, and they went out across the grassland into our greener pastures. And I thought to myself, that's the wisdom of wildlife. Why can't the rest of us learn to take care of each other like that? Thank you all very much for being here.